The dean was 3 names away from mine when I saw my mother find her seat in the fourth row. She didn't know it was the fourth row from the stage. She thought she was sitting far enough back to watch quietly. Maybe leave before anyone noticed her. Maybe finally catch me in the lie she'd flown 2 states to expose. My father sat beside her in a blazer he only wore to church and funerals. My brother Grant sat on his other side, already checking his phone, already bored. The way he got bored with anything that wasn't about him. They had come to prove I was still exactly what they'd been telling people for 6 years. A dropout, a disappointment, a cautionary tale you brought up at dinner to make your other child look good by comparison. I straightened my robe and watched the program and my hands shake slightly, not from nerves, from the specific, quiet thrill of a person who has done the math and knows exactly how it ends. 2 names before mine, the dean paused and said there was a special note in the program that year. A fellowship being announced for the first time in 14 years, funded by a trust that had finally, formally, come home. I watched my mother's face as she read the name printed under that note. I watched her go very still. The way people go still right before they understand something they cannot take back. My name was next. But to understand what happened when I walked across that stage, you have to go back 6 years to a kitchen table, a folder, and a version of my life my own family invented so they wouldn't have to explain where the money went. Welcome to Sophie Revenge Diaries, where the ones everyone underestimated let the paperwork do the talking. I'm Nora. If you've ever been the child your family found it easier to write off than to be honest about, stay with me, because that folder is about to open. Drop a comment and subscribe before we start, because you don't want to miss how this one ends. I grew up in a house where my grandfather's photograph sat on the mantle in a frame nicer than any photograph of the people who actually lived there. Walter Milner, my mother's father. He built a machine shop from nothing. No college, no family money. Just 40 years of showing up at 5 in the morning until he owned the building instead of renting it. He used to tell me, when I was small enough to sit on his knee at the shop, that the smartest thing he ever did was learn to read a blueprint nobody else in the room could read. He said knowledge was the only inheritance nobody could repossess. He died when I was 12. At the funeral, my mother cried in a way I'd never seen her cry, and my father held her hand the whole service. And I remember thinking, even then, that grief looked a lot like relief on some people. I didn't understand yet what I was seeing. I would understand it fully 16 years later, in a lawyer's office, over a document with my grandfather's signature on the last page. What I did know, growing up, was that I was my grandfather's favorite, not my brother Grant, who was 3 years older, louder, and better at filling a room. Me. He used to say I asked questions like I actually wanted the answer. He left my brother a set of tools and a watch. He left me a trust, the Milner Education Trust. $22,000 a year, adjusted for tuition inflation, meant to cover any accredited college or graduate program I attended, administered by a bank trust department, with my father named as trustee because I was 12 and someone had to sign the paperwork until I turned 18. I didn't think much about the trust as a kid. It was just a fact of my life. The way some kids grow up knowing there's a college fund and don't ask questions about the mechanics of it. What I noticed instead, slowly, over years, the way you notice a floor tilting 1 degree at a time, was that my house ran on a different set of rules for Grant than it did for me. When Grant failed out of his first semester of college, my parents called it a rough transition. When I brought home a report card with 1B on it, my father asked what happened. When Grant wrecked his car twice in 1 year, my mother said boys were hard on machines. When I asked to borrow the car to study at the library, I got a lecture about responsibility. I want to be clear about something, because it matters for the rest of the story. I wasn't a rebellious kid. I wasn't looking for a fight. I was the kid who did the dishes without being asked, who kept my grades up because I liked school, who genuinely believed, the way children do, that if I was good enough and quiet enough, the scale in that house would eventually balance itself out. It never did. It just tilted further. By the time I was in high school, Grant had dropped out of two different colleges, and my parents had started a habit I wouldn't fully understand for another decade. Every time Grant needed money, my father found it, not from his own salary, from somewhere else. I didn't know where yet. I was 17. I had a grandfather's trust with my name on it, and a father who managed it, and I had no reason in the world to think those two facts were connected. I got into a good state university with a partial academic scholarship, which felt, at 18, like the first proof in my life that effort actually paid off. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with the acceptance letter, waiting for my parents to be proud of me the way I'd watched other parents be proud of their kids at graduation. My mother said, "That's nice, honey," and went back to a phone call about Grant's new restaurant idea. Grant, at 21, had decided he wanted to open a restaurant. Not work in one first, not save for one. Open one, with a full commercial kitchen and a hired chef, because he had, in his words, a vision for the neighborhood. My father, an accountant by trade, a careful man with numbers who did other people's taxes for a living, sat at that same kitchen table and helped Grant draw up a business plan that any actual accountant should have known was built on sand. I asked, once, carefully, where the money for the restaurant was coming from. My father said it was being handled. That phrase became the answer to almost everything in our house for the next several years. It was being handled. I started college that fall and made a discovery that reorganized my entire understanding of my own life. My tuition bill wasn't being paid by the trust. It was being paid, in part, by financial aid, and the rest by me, working two jobs, one at a campus library and one waiting tables on weekends. When I call home, confused, and asked my father about the trust, he told me the trust required paperwork he hadn't gotten around to yet, that the bank was slow, that I should just take out the loan for now and he'd reimburse me later. I believed him. That's the part one needs you to sit with, because it's the part that makes everything after it so much heavier. I believed my own father, because he was my father, and because the alternative, that he was lying to my face at a kitchen table while my grandfather's photograph watched from the mantel, wasn't a thought I let myself finish. So I worked. I took out loans. I studied at a library table with a coffee going cold beside my notebook while other kids on my floor called home for grocery money. I told myself it was building character. I told myself a lot of things during those years, the way you do when the truth is too expensive to look at directly. Grant's restaurant opened during my sophomore year. It failed within 14 months. My father called it a market timing issue. He helped Grant open a second one 18 months after that, smaller, in a different part of town, with a story about how this time it would be different because Grant had learned so much from the first one. I graduated with honors and $41,000 in student loans. Nobody from my family came to the ceremony. My mother said the drive was too far, and the timing conflicted with Grant's soft opening for the second restaurant. I stood in that crowd of families taking photographs, and I called my mother afterward, and she asked how it went like she was asking about a dentist appointment. That was the year the story about me started. I didn't hear it directly. I heard it the way you hear most things about yourself, secondhand, through a cousin, months later, at a family gathering I wasn't invited to. My mother had told my aunt that I was struggling, that things hadn't worked out the way I'd hoped, that I'd taken some time off from school to figure things out. I hadn't taken time off from anything. I had just graduated, with honors. I want to walk you through exactly how the lie grew, because it didn't arrive all at once. It grew the way weeds grow, one small untended patch at a time, until you look up and the whole yard belongs to something you didn't plant. I went straight from undergraduate into a paralegal job at a mid-sized law firm downtown, telling myself I'd apply to law school once I'd paid down some of the loan and saved enough to survive 3 more years of tuition. I was good at the work. I liked the precision of it. The way a case either had the paper trail to support it or it didn't. The way a signature either matched or it didn't. I didn't know yet how useful that particular skill would become inside my own family. I still went to Sunday dinners for a while. I still called my mother every week. And slowly, over those calls, I started to notice a strange gap between what I was living and what my mother seemed to think I was living. She'd ask if I'd found a job yet, months after I'd started the paralegal position I'd told her about twice. She'd mention, almost in passing, that she hoped I'd get back into school someday, like my degree hadn't happened, like the ceremony she skipped had been canceled instead of simply unattended. At first, I thought she was distracted. My mother has always been a woman who hears you and files you under whatever she already believes about you, rather than updating the file. But then my Aunt Carol called me directly, worried, gentle, the way people are when they think they're checking in on someone who's struggling. Nora, honey, she said, your mother told us you dropped out sophomore year. Is everything okay? Do you need anything? I sat on my kitchen floor with the phone against my ear for a long moment before I could answer. I dropped out. Sophomore year. 2 years after I'd actually graduated with honors, worked full time, and been paying my own loans on time every single month. I told my aunt the truth. I told her I graduated, that I had the paralegal job, that I was doing fine. She believed me instantly. The way people do when the truth is simply, obviously true and doesn't require decoration. But she also told me something that took the floor out from under me a second time. Your mother's told that story to a lot of people, Nora. She said it kind of sadly, like it was hard for her to hear. She said you just weren't cut out for it, that some kids aren't, and that's all right. But that Grant is really thriving with the restaurants. I hung up the phone and I sat on that floor for a long time, not crying. I want to be honest, because this whole story is about honesty. And the honest thing is that I didn't cry. I felt something colder than that settle into my chest, the specific cold of understanding, all at once. That the people who were supposed to be proud of me had decided it was more useful to be embarrassed by me instead. I started asking myself the question that would eventually unravel everything. Why would my mother lie about something so easy to check? A degree either exists or it doesn't. A diploma either hangs on a wall or it doesn't. What did she gain from telling people I'd failed at the one thing I'd actually succeeded at? I didn't have an answer yet, but I started to suspect the answer wasn't really about me at all. I suspected it was about money, and where it had gone, and who needed a story to explain the gap. I want to tell you about the year everything tilted from suspicion into certainty, because it started with something almost too small to notice. A letter, forwarded to my apartment by the post office because my parents had, at some point, changed their mailing address on an old account of mine without asking. It was from the trust department at the bank. An annual statement, not addressed to my father this time, but to me directly, because the trust document specified that once I turned 25, the bank was required to send me a copy of the annual accounting whether the trustee liked it or not. My grandfather, careful man that he was, had built that clause in himself. He didn't trust anyone completely, not even his own son-in-law, and I would come to understand exactly how right he'd been to feel that way. I opened it standing at my own kitchen counter, mildly curious, expecting some modest number, a fund that had sat mostly untouched while I paid my own way through school out of stubbornness and pride. The balance was $14,000. It should have held, by my own rough math, standing there with a coffee going cold in my hand, somewhere close to 130,000. I read the transaction history twice, the way I read everything twice, because I am a person who reads everything twice. Disbursements going back 9 years. Regular, sizable, and every single one of them logged under the same category. Tuition and education expenses, Nora R. Whitfield. I had never seen a dollar of that money. I had loans with my name on them totaling over $60,000 to prove it. I sat down at my kitchen table, The same kind of table I'd once sat at with an acceptance letter nobody looked at. And I felt the strange calm settle over me that I would come to recognize over the following months as the feeling of a person finally standing on solid ground after years of standing on something that only looked solid. I didn't call my parents. I want you to notice that, because it matters. The old version of me, the one who spent years trying to earn a seat at that table, would have called immediately, upset, asking for an explanation, giving them time to build one. The version of me sitting in that kitchen with a bank statement in her hand had spent 4 years working in a law office. I knew exactly what happened to evidence once the person it implicated knew you had it. So I did what I'd learned to do at work. I made a copy. I put the original somewhere safe. And I started building a file. The trust statement gave me 9 years of transaction dates. That was my starting point. I requested my own student loan records, my own tuition invoices from both my undergraduate years, documents I already had, because I paid every one of those bills myself and kept every receipt out of habit. The same habit that made me keep every check stub from every shift I'd ever worked. I lined the two timelines up side by side on my kitchen table like two patience charts that didn't match. My real tuition invoices, the ones I had paid, in full, out of loans and my own paychecks. And the trust tuition invoices, the ones my father had submitted to the bank as justification for each disbursement. Requesting copies through a formal records request the bank was required to honor once I was a named beneficiary requesting my own file. They didn't match. Not the amounts, not the dates, and in 3 cases, not even the school. Two of the invoices submitted to the trust listed a culinary institute in another state. I had never once set foot in that building. I had never applied there. I didn't need a forensic document examiner to tell me what my eyes could already see. The signature at the bottom of those invoices, meant to be a school registrar's, was shaky in a way that photocopied signatures often are when someone has traced them from somewhere else. I called the school listed on those two invoices. A woman in their records office, kind and unbothered, confirmed within 4 minutes what I already suspected. No student named Nora Whitfield had ever enrolled there. She offered to email me a formal letter confirming it, unprompted, because that's simply what a records office does when you ask a straightforward question, and the answer is a straightforward no. I want you to notice the school, a culinary institute, not a coincidence. Grant's second restaurant had sent two of its kitchen staff through a short certificate program at that same culinary institute the year before it closed, a fact I found later. Buried in an old social media post where Grant had tagged the school and thanked his father for making it possible. The money marked as my tuition had paid for Grant's staff training. I sat with that for 3 full days before I did anything else. Not because I doubted it, because I needed, the way you need with anything this large, to be completely sure before I said a single word out loud to anyone. I found Marguerite fell through a colleague at the firm where I still worked, a trust and estates attorney with a reputation for being unhurried and exact, the kind of lawyer other lawyers hire when the matter is personal. I sat across from her desk with a folder in my lap, the same manila kind you'd use for anything, and I told her the whole story, start to finish, in the flattest voice I could manage, because I had learned by then that the flatter you told the truth, the harder it was for anyone to accuse you of exaggerating. Marguerite listened without interrupting, which I appreciated more than I expected to. When I finished, she asked to see the documents, and she went through them slowly. The trust statement, my real tuition records, the forged invoices, the culinary school's letter, laying them out on her desk in the same side-by-side comparison I'd made at my kitchen table. Except now they had a professional's eyes on them instead of just mine. This is a strong case, she said finally. Not because it's dramatic, because it's boring, in the way good cases are boring. Every piece of it is a document. Documents don't get emotional on the stand. She explained what came next in plain terms. the way I come to appreciate from every professional I dealt with in this whole ordeal. As a named beneficiary, I had the legal right to demand a full accounting of the trust from the trustee, my father, going back to its inception. If he refused, or if the accounting revealed what we already suspected, we could petition the probate court to compel one, and beyond that, to seek restitution for any funds improperly disbursed. There's something else you should know, Marguerite said, and this was the moment the whole shape of the case changed for me. Your grandfather built in an unusual clause. If the trustee fails to provide a proper annual accounting for 2 consecutive years, or if the trust administrator finds a material discrepancy in disbursement records, oversight of the trust transfers automatically out of the trustee's hands and into the hands of the institution named as successor administrator. In this case, that's the university trust office connected to the scholarship fund your grandfather also endowed the same year he set up your trust. I didn't know about a scholarship fund. Marguerite slid a copy of the original 1998 trust document across the desk. And there it was. A clause I'd never seen because I'd never had reason to read the founding paperwork. Only the annual statements. Walter Milner hadn't just left me an education trust. He'd left a standing endowment at the university's trust office, dormant unless triggered, meant to formally recognize whichever beneficiary the trust actually served, the moment the trust's own administration failed. My grandfather, a man with no college degree of his own, had built a trap door into his own generosity, because some part of him, even 20-some years ago, hadn't fully trusted the people he was leaving it with. He'd been right not to. Marguerite sent the formal demand for accounting to my father by certified mail on a Tuesday. I remember the day because I went to Sunday dinner that week, my first in over a year, specifically because I wanted to watch my father's face and give away nothing myself. I'd learned that much from 4 years of paralegal work. You don't tip your hand before the paperwork does the talking for you. My father seemed distracted at dinner, but not alarmed, and I understood why 2 days later when Marguerite called to say his attorney had responded, calling the demand a misunderstanding and offering a partial informal explanation instead of a real accounting. My father's letter, through his lawyer, said the funds had been used for my education broadly construed, including expenses related to my broader family's support during a difficult financial period, and that he'd intended to formalize the paperwork eventually. Marguerite read me that line over the phone and then said, calmly, that's an admission dressed up as an excuse. He just told us, in writing, through his own attorney, that the money went somewhere other than your education. We filed a petition to compel a full accounting in probate court the following month. I want to be clear about something, because I know some of you are picturing a courtroom scene with raised voices and a judge banging a gavel. It wasn't like that. It was quiet and procedural, the way most real legal matters are. A filing, a hearing date on a calendar, my father's attorney requesting an extension, Marguerite opposing it in 4 sentences that took her 10 minutes to write, and that the judge granted in about the same amount of time. While the court process moved at its own slow pace, I kept building my own file, because Marguerite had told me something I've never forgotten. The court will eventually see the financial records. But if this ever becomes something more than paperwork, if it ever becomes something your family has to answer for in front of people whose opinion they actually value, you'll want more than bank statements. You'll want the human side of it too. So I started collecting that. My Aunt Carol agreed, without hesitation, to write down what my mother had told her, word for word as best she remembered it, and the date it happened. I found 2 old group texts, sent to a cousin's phone and forwarded to me, where my mother, as recently as 4 months earlier, had written that I dropped out, and it broke her heart, but some people just aren't built for that kind of pressure. 4 months earlier, not 9 years ago, when the story might have made some twisted kind of sense as an excuse. 4 months earlier, while I was in my second year of law school, on the dean's list, working as a research assistant for a professor who would later write me one of my strongest recommendation letters. My mother was still telling that story fresh, in real time, to people who might otherwise have been proud of me. That detail did something to me that the bank statements hadn't. The forged invoices were about money. The group text was about who I was allowed to be in my own family story. And I understood, reading it on my phone in my apartment, that I wasn't only building a legal case anymore. I was building the truth, the actual timeline of my own life, because somebody needed to, and it clearly wasn't going to be them. I haven't told you yet how I ended up in law school in the first place, and I think this is the moment to say it, because everything that happened afterward only makes sense once you understand what it cost. I applied the year after the bank statement arrived, not because of the trust, not at first, but because 4 years of paralegal work had taught me that I liked this world. The world of documents and timelines and things that could be proven more than I'd expected to. I studied for the admissions test in the mornings, before my shift, and in the 2 hours after it ended, at a library table not unlike the one from undergrad. Except the coffee this time was mine to buy and nobody was waiting for me to fail. I got in, not to the flashiest school in the country, but to a respected one, with a partial scholarship that covered less than half of what I needed. I financed the rest the only way I knew how by then. Loans stacked on top of loans. A night shift at a records processing company 2 evenings a week. And a strict, almost military discipline about which expenses were necessary and which weren't. I told my parents I'd been accepted. My mother's response was a text that said, "That's nice. We'll see how it goes." My father didn't respond at all. Grant, when he found out, made a joke at a family gathering I wasn't at but heard about later. Something about how I'd always liked being the smart one and law school was just a very expensive way of proving it to myself. I want to tell you honestly that none of that stopped hurting. Every single time. I used to think, somewhere around my second year, that eventually the sting would wear off, that enough distance would turn it into something I could shrug about. It didn't. It just got quieter. The way a headache gets quieter when you learn to work around it instead of waiting for it to go away. What kept me steady through those years wasn't anger. I want to be precise about that, because I think people expect anger to be the fuel in a story like this, and it wasn't, not really. What kept me steady was a specific, stubborn kind of certainty that had been growing in me since that letter arrived at my kitchen counter. Somewhere, on paper, in a filing cabinet or a bank's server or a probate court's docket, the truth already existed, fully formed, waiting for someone patient enough to lay it all out in order. I didn't need to convince anyone of anything. I just needed to let the documents speak, eventually, in a room where the right people were listening. That's what carried me through the bar exam study schedule stacked on top of my night job. That's what carried me through the year my apartment's heat went out for 6 days in January, and I studied in a coffee shop instead of asking my parents for a single dollar. That's what carried me, honestly, through the loneliest parts, the holidays I spent working instead of going home. Because going home meant sitting at a table where my accomplishments were treated as rumors and my brother's failures were treated as growing pains. The court-ordered accounting finally arrived 11 months after Marguerite filed the petition, delivered the way these things usually are, in a box of records rather than a single dramatic document. I sat in Marguerite's conference room while her paralegal, a careful young man named Owen, walked me through it page by page, because by then I understood exactly how much patience this kind of truth demanded. The full picture was worse than I'd let myself imagine, even after everything. Over 9 years, my father had authorized 11 separate disbursements from the trust, totaling just over $119,000. Every single one logged as an education expense for me. Of those 11, 4 were supported by invoices for schools I had genuinely attended, but for amounts inflated well beyond what I'd actually been billed, the difference pocketed or redirected. The remaining 7 were entirely fabricated, invoices for programs I had never enrolled in, at institutions that, in 2 cases, confirmed in writing they had no record of me whatsoever. Cross-referenced against Grant's business filings, which Marguerite had subpoenaed as part of the accounting. The pattern was almost embarrassingly clean. Every fabricated disbursement lined up, within weeks, with a deposit into either Grant's personal account or one of his 2 failed restaurant LLCs. A staff training program, a kitchen equipment lease, a round of payroll during the second restaurant's final, doomed summer. My education, on paper, had quietly financed my brother's business failures, one forged invoice at a time, while I financed my actual education myself, dollar by dollar, shift by shift. There was one more document in that box that I hadn't expected, and it's the one that stayed with me longest. A handwritten note from my grandfather, filed with his original trust paperwork, apparently meant to be read only if the trust oversight clause was ever triggered. Marguerite read it aloud to me because my hands, for the first time in this entire process, weren't steady enough to hold the page. It said, in his plain engineer's handwriting, "If you're reading this, someone didn't do right by Nora." I always figured she'd be the one who kept things standing after I was gone. Not because she asked to be, but because she's built that way. Make sure she gets what's hers, and make sure she knows I never doubted her, whatever anybody told her in the meantime. He had written that note before I turned 13. He had suspected, even then, exactly what might happen. And he had built a door in the wall specifically so the truth could get out eventually, whether or not the people responsible ever chose to open it themselves. I sat in that conference room and I cried, finally, for the first time in this entire 6-year stretch, not from the money, not from the forged documents, but from a dead man's handwriting telling me he'd known, all along, exactly who I was. With the accounting complete and the restitution petition moving toward a settlement conference, Marguerite told me something practical that shaped everything I did next. Courts move slowly, she said, and money, once it's been spent on a failed restaurant, isn't always easy to recover in full, regardless of what a judge eventually orders. The legal process would get me a judgment. It might take years to fully collect on it. That was simply the reality of pursuing money that had already been poured into a business that no longer existed. But there was something the legal process couldn't give me, and something I realized. Sitting in her office that day, I wanted more than the money itself. I wanted the story corrected, in the same rooms where the false version had been told, in front of the same people who had heard it. I was 3 months from graduating law school. My mother had, as recently as the previous fall, repeated the dropout story to a family friend who happened to mention it to my aunt, who mentioned it to me. The lie was still alive, still being fed, even as I stood one semester from a Juris Doctor with honors. So I did something that surprised even Marguerite. I mailed my parents a formal invitation to my graduation. Not a phone call, not a text they could screenshot and delete. An actual card, the kind with the university's crest on it, addressed to Carl and Denise Whitfield, informing them their daughter would be receiving her degree on a specific date, at a specific time, in a specific auditorium. I didn't explain what degree. I didn't mention the fellowship announcement I already knew was coming, because Marguerite had, by then, coordinated with the university's trust office regarding the endowment my grandfather had triggered. I wanted my parents to come in exactly the state of mind I suspected they would. Curious, skeptical, maybe even hoping to catch me in some kind of lie. Because that's the only frame they had left for who I might be. I found out later, from my aunt, that my mother's first reaction to the invitation was suspicion. She apparently told Carol she didn't understand what kind of graduation this could possibly be. Wondered aloud if I was trying to embarrass them by inviting them to something small and calling it important. Grant, apparently, said it would be funny to go and see whatever this was for himself. They came, in the end, for exactly the reason I'd hoped they would. Not out of pride, out of the specific, Small-minded curiosity of people who couldn't quite believe the story they'd been telling for 6 years might not hold up if they actually looked at it directly. I want to tell you honestly what that morning felt like, because I think it's the part people assume was the hardest, and it wasn't. By the time I put on my robe in a shared dressing room with 40 other graduates, checking my hood in a mirror that had seen 100 nervous faces that week alone, I had already done the hard part. The hard part had been 6 years of night jobs and library tables and holidays spent alone. The hard part had been the accounting, the forged invoices, the 11-month wait for a court to move at a court's pace. What was left, standing in that mirror, was simply the last page of a very long document, and I had read every page before it twice. Marguerite had explained to me, a week earlier, exactly what would be announced during the ceremony, because the university's trust office had coordinated the timing deliberately. Once they understood the situation, the Milner Founders Fellowship, dormant for over 2 decades, would be formally activated and awarded that day, publicly, as part of the program, to the graduating student whose family trust had triggered its founding clause. Me. Not a courtroom, not a private letter, a stage, a program booklet, and several hundred witnesses who had no idea they were about to become witnesses to anything at all. I found my seat in the graduate section, and I didn't look for my family in the crowd, though I knew. From the invitation's RSVP card Marguerite's office had quietly tracked that all three of them were attending. I let myself focus instead on the ordinary, physical facts in front of me. The stiff chair, the program in my lap, the low hum of families finding their seats behind me. The dean began reading names in alphabetical order, the long, familiar rhythm of any graduation, name, degree, a small round of applause, the next name. I sat through nearly 200 of them, calm in a way I hadn't expected to feel. Calm the way you feel checking a chart you've already reviewed twice and know is correct. Then the dean paused before the W names, cleared her throat, and told the auditorium there was a special announcement in this year's program they wanted to make before continuing. The dean explained, briefly, in the plain language university officials use for these things, that the law school's trust office had recently completed the activation of an education endowment established over 2 decades earlier by a local machinist named Walter Milner, a man who had never attended college himself, but who believed, in the dean's words, that the right kind of stubborn persistence deserved to be recognized formally, not just quietly. She said the endowment had come to the university's attention through a legal matter involving the original family trust, and that, per the trust's own terms, it was now being awarded, along with full retroactive tuition credit, to this year's graduating beneficiary. I watched my mother's face from 4 rows back, through the small gap between the students seated ahead of me, and I watched her read the name printed under that announcement in the program in her lap, because the university's trust office had, at my request through Marguerite, made sure the name was printed exactly the way it should have been printed years earlier. Nora R. Whitfield. She went very still. My father leaned over to read it too, and I watched something drain out of his face that had nothing to do with the auditorium's lighting. Then the dean said my name, for my actual degree, and the room did what it does for every name, applause. Brief and warm and utterly ordinary to everyone else in it. I stood, and I walked up those 3 shallow steps, and I shook the dean's hand, and I did not look at my family, not because I was avoiding them, but because for the first time in 6 years, they were not the point of the moment I was standing in. I want to tell you what happened next honestly, because I promised myself, walking into that auditorium, that I would not turn this day into a performance the way my mother had turned so many family moments into one. I didn't stop at a microphone. I didn't make a speech. The dean simply added one more sentence after my name was read, a formality the trust office had cleared with me the week before, noting that I was this year's recipient of the Milner Founders Fellowship, established in memory of a grandfather who, the program read, believed education was the one debt that should never go unpaid. That single sentence did more work in that auditorium than any speech I could have written myself. Because sitting 4 rows back were the two people who had spent 6 years telling everyone I couldn't finish what I started. And every single person near them in that section had just heard, in a university dean's own voice, that a trust bearing my grandfather's name and mine had just been formally and legally recognized in front of them. I didn't need to say a word. The paperwork had finally learned how to speak for itself in a room, out loud, exactly the way Marguerite had told me it eventually would. I found my family in the lobby afterward, not because I was looking for a confrontation, but because Carol, my aunt, who had come on her own separate invitation and had been sitting near enough to see everything, found me first, and my parents were 3 feet behind her, unable, it seemed, to decide whether to approach or leave. My mother spoke first, and her voice had none of its usual certainty in it. She asked what that announcement had meant, whether there had been some kind of mistake with the program. I told her the truth, plainly, the same way I told everyone the truth for the past 11 months, without decoration. Because decoration was never the thing that had been missing from this story. The mistake, I told her, wasn't in the program. The mistake was 9 years old, and it had my father's signature on it, and a court had already reviewed the accounting proving it. My father didn't argue. I want you to notice that, because it told me something important about how much he already knew was coming. He asked, quietly, standing in a crowded lobby full of other families taking photographs, whether this meant I was suing them. I told him the accounting was already complete, that a settlement conference was scheduled for the following month, and that whatever happened in that room would happen on paper, calmly, the way it should have happened 9 years ago instead of a forged invoice for a culinary school I'd never set foot in. My mother's face did something I hadn't expected. Not anger, not yet. Something closer to the specific horror of a person realizing, in real time, that the story she told so many people for so long had just been formally, publicly contradicted by an institution with no reason to lie. Grant, standing slightly behind them, said the only thing he said to me that entire day. He asked, quietly, if the money from the trust had really gone to the restaurants. I told him yes, all of it, both times, with his own kitchen staff's training program listed as one of the fabricated invoices. He didn't say anything else. He just looked, for a long moment, at our father, in a way I had never once seen him look at him before. I didn't gloat. I want to be honest about that, because I could have. I had 6 years and a court order and a dead man's handwritten note giving me every right to. Instead, I told them, calmly, that the settlement conference would go forward regardless of anything said in that lobby, and that I hoped, for everyone's sake, they'd bring their attorney and let the numbers do what numbers do. Then I turned around, and I found Carol, who hugged me the way I'd needed someone in my family to hug me for 6 straight years. And we went and got coffee. And I let the rest of the afternoon be exactly as ordinary and quiet as any other graduate's afternoon deserved to be. The settlement conference happened 5 weeks later, in a plain room with a mediator, 2 attorneys, and considerably less drama than the graduation had. My father's accountant background worked against him in a specific, procedural way Marguerite had predicted from the start. As a licensed CPA, he was bound by professional standards that had nothing to do with our family and everything to do with the state board that issued his license. And the moment the forged invoices became part of a court record, that board opened its own separate inquiry, entirely outside my control, simply because that's what boards do when a licensed accountant's signature turns up on fabricated documents. I hadn't filed that complaint. I want to be clear about that, because people sometimes assume the most damage in a story like this comes from the angriest decision. And it doesn't. The most damage came from the ordinary, procedural fact that my father had built his whole professional identity on being a careful, trustworthy man with numbers, and a probate court accounting had just demonstrated in plain figures, that he wasn't one, at least not where it counted most. The settlement itself was almost anticlimactic after everything that led to it. My parents agreed to a repayment structure for the full $119,000 plus interest, secured against a portion of their retirement accounts and a lien against the family house. Because the restaurants themselves had nothing left to take, Grant, who had no legal exposure himself since he hadn't been the one signing trust paperwork, nonetheless offered, unprompted, during the mediation, to contribute a portion of his own savings toward the repayment. It wasn't much, but it was the first time in the entire 6 years that anyone in my family had put their own money towards something instead of mine. My mother never apologized in the mediation room. I didn't expect her to. What she did instead, months later, was send me a letter, an actual letter, handwritten, admitting that she told people I dropped out because it was easier than explaining where the money had gone, and that somewhere along the way she'd started to believe her own excuse instead of remembering it was one. It wasn't everything, but it was more honesty than she'd offered in 6 years, and I read it twice, the way I read everything, and I put it away in the same folder where I keep my grandfather's note. I passed the bar exam that same year, on the first attempt, and took a position at a small firm that handles exactly the kind of case that built my own life apart from my family. Trust and estate disputes, the quiet kind of injustice that hides behind ordinary paperwork until someone patient enough reads it twice. My father's CPA license was suspended for 18 months following the state board's review, a consequence that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with a signature he chose to put on documents that weren't true. He works now, I'm told, doing bookkeeping for a small hardware store 2 towns over, the kind of quiet and glamorous work that used to be beneath the version of himself he built his whole reputation around. Grant closed what remained of his second restaurant within the year, not because of the settlement, but because it had been failing long before any of this came out, propped up on borrowed time and borrowed money in equal measure. He called me, unexpectedly, about 8 months after the graduation, and asked, in a voice I'd never heard him use before, if I'd help him understand how student loans actually worked, because he was thinking about finishing the degree he'd walked away from at 21. I said yes, not because I'd forgotten what his restaurants had cost me, but because he was the first person in that house to ever ask me a real question instead of assuming an answer about me. My mother and I speak now, occasionally, carefully. I haven't rebuilt the closeness I used to want so badly from her, the kind I spent years earning report cards and quiet dinners trying to buy. What I have instead is smaller and more honest, which turned out to matter more than I expected. She knows now, in a way she can't unknow, exactly what actually happened during the years she told people I'd failed. That knowledge sits between us at every dinner we still occasionally share, quiet, unspoken, but present, the way a document sits in a drawer even after everyone in the room has stopped talking about it. I kept my grandfather's note framed next to my law license, in the small office I rent above a bakery downtown. Some clients ask about it. I tell them it's from the man who taught me that the truth doesn't need you to defend it loudly. It just needs you to keep the paperwork long enough for someone to finally read it. I think about that graduation stage sometimes, not the applause, not even my mother's face in that fourth row. I think about the moment right before my name was called, sitting in that stiff auditorium chair with 6 years of night shifts and library tables and forged invoices behind me, feeling, for the first time in longer than I could remember, completely and calmly certain of exactly who I was, regardless of what anyone in that room had been told. They spent 6 years telling people I dropped out. It took one afternoon, one folder, and one dead man's careful handwriting to tell them who actually never gave up. If your family ever needed you to be the failure so their own story made sense, hear this. Your worth was never theirs to write. Tell me in the comments if you've ever had to prove the truth on paper because your own family wouldn't believe it out loud. Share this with someone who kept every receipt for a reason. And subscribe to Quiet Proof Stories, where the ones who were underestimated always, eventually, let the paperwork stand up and speak for itself.